The day Kate Holloway was handed over like a sack of grain, she swore on her mother's grave that she would never again let a man decide her worth. But the man who received her had no intention of keeping her at all. The year was 1873, and the Texas Panhandle was a land that swallowed the weak and spat out the bones. The sky stretched enormous and pale above the scrub grass, broken only by the occasional rise of red clay bluffs and the thin silver thread of the Canadian River winding south. The cattle drives had turned ordinary men into kings and desperate men into gamblers. And in that country, everything had a price: land, horses, water rights, and apparently women. Kate was 22 years old, sharp-eyed and harder than most people gave her credit for. She had her mother's dark auburn hair and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had learned to read by firelight in a one-room house on the edge of the Llano Estacado. She was not a woman who cried easily, which is why she was furious at herself for the burning behind her eyes as Silas Holloway, her father, clasped the hand of Denton Crale across the worn plank table in the back of the Dusty Fork saloon and called the deal done. Denton Crale was 47 years old, with a face like old saddle leather and small gray eyes that moved the way a rat's eyes moved: quick, calculating, never still. He ran a cattle brokerage out of Amarillo that was half legitimate business and half something else entirely, and everybody in Tascosa County knew it. He owned 2,000 acres of good grazing land along the river, 3 stone-faced men who did his heavy work, and a reputation for collecting debts in ways that left a lasting impression. Silas Holloway had borrowed money from Denton Crale 6 months ago to purchase a herd of longhorns. The plan had been sensible at the time: drive the cattle north to the Kansas railhead at Dodge City, sell them to the buyers from the eastern packing houses, come home flush enough to clear the debt and put something aside for the winter. The plan had failed in the way that only West Texas plans could fail, spectacularly and completely. A late-season storm scattered 200 head. 3 drovers quit outside of Mobedy. The remaining cattle arrived thin and fractious, and the Kansas buyers paid half of what had been promised. Silas came home with empty pockets and a debt of $800 he had no earthly way to repay. $800 in 1873 was not a small thing. It was the difference between keeping a ranch and losing everything to the bank. Silas Holloway was 56 years old, and the ranch was the only thing he had left in the world, the only legacy he had to offer, the only proof that his years of hard labor had amounted to something. He was a man who had made 1,000 poor decisions in his life, but he had always believed that the land would redeem him. He could not let the land go, so he sat across from Denton Crale in the Dusty Fork saloon, and he made the worst decision of all. Kate was to be given to Crale as collateral against the debt. Not as a wife. Crale already had a wife, a pale and silent woman named Edna who people rarely saw. As a housekeeper, Crale said, though the word sat in the room like something rotten. She would live and work in his household until the debt was repaid, at which point she would be returned to her father free and clear. The arrangement would be formalized with a paper that Crale's man had already drawn up, because Crale was the sort of man who liked his arrangements to be documented. Kate had not been asked her opinion on any of this. She heard about it the same way she heard about everything in her father's house. She was sitting in the next room while the men talked, her ear pressed to the thin wall between the parlor and the kitchen, her hands wrapped tight around a cold coffee cup. When she heard her own name spoken in that flat, transactional way, something inside her went very cold and very still. She walked out through the back door of the saloon without letting anyone see her face. She stood behind the building in the alley between the saloon and the dry goods store, and she pressed her back against the rough timber planks, and she breathed. The sun was sliding toward the horizon, painting the dust in shades of copper and rust. Somewhere down the street, a horse was being shod, the rhythmic ring of the smith's hammer carrying clean and clear through the early evening air. A mockingbird was running through its repertoire in the branches of the one cottonwood tree that had managed to survive at the end of Main Street. Kate listened to the mockingbird, and she thought about her options. Running was the first thing that came to mind, but it lasted only a moment. She had $4.30 sewn into the hem of her second dress, and the nearest town with any kind of opportunity for a woman alone was Dodge City, which was a very long way to go on $4.30. She had no horse of her own. She had no kin outside of Tascosa County who would take her in. Running was a luxury that required resources she did not have. The second option was refusing, but she understood with a clarity that was almost physical how little her refusal would mean. This was 1873 in West Texas, and whatever the law said on paper about women and their rights was not the law that was practiced out here in the dust and the wind. Her father had signed a paper. Denton Crale had cosigned it. Her opinion was not a relevant legal consideration. The third option was endurance. She was good at endurance. She had been practicing it her whole life. She pushed off from the wall, smoothed her skirt, and walked back inside the saloon with her chin up and her eyes dry. Silas was still at the table. He looked up when she came in, and she saw the guilt on his face, raw and obvious and useless. She did not say anything to him. She sat down in the chair beside him and folded her hands on the table and looked at Denton Crale with the clearest, most level gaze she could manage, and she said, "I heard what you arranged. I want it in writing that my father's debt is considered fully settled the moment I leave your employment." Crale looked amused. "That's already in the paper, Miss Holloway." "I want it in a second paper," she said. "One that I keep." The amusement flickered into something sharper for just a moment, and then Crale smiled, showing teeth that weren't quite even. "You're a careful woman," he said. "I try to be," Kate said. She got her second paper. She left for the Crale ranch the next morning, sitting in the back of Crale's freight wagon with her one trunk and her second dress and her $4.30, watching her father's house disappear behind a low rise of scrubland and thinking that whatever happened next, she would find a way through it. She had not cried. She refused to cry. The Crale Ranch was 12 miles south of Tascosa, a compound of stone and adobe buildings that crouched against the base of a low bluff, as though trying to hide from the open sky. There was the main house, a bunkhouse for Crale's hands, a large barn, a smokehouse, and a stone-walled pen that held about 30 horses. It was a prosperous-looking operation in the way that places built by relentless self-interest often looked prosperous, efficient, functional, stripped of anything that wasn't useful. There were no flowers in the yard. There were no curtains in the windows. The whole place had the feel of a clenched fist. Edna Crale met her at the door. She was a woman who had once been pretty, Kate thought, though it was hard to say what she had looked like before Denton Crale's household had finished with her. She was perhaps 40, thin to the point of frailty, with eyes that had learned not to hold any particular expression for longer than a moment. She showed Kate to a small room off the kitchen that held a cot, a wooden chair, and a hook on the wall, and she explained the household duties in a voice so quiet Kate had to lean in to hear her. Kate put her trunk under the cot, hung her second dress on the hook, and went to work. The weeks passed in a grind of labor that was at least mercifully consuming. She cooked and cleaned and laundered and mended, and learned the geography of the kitchen the way a prisoner learns the geography of a cell. Every corner's shadow, every place that belonged to her and every place that did not. Crale left her alone, which she had half expected and half feared would not be the case. He was not interested in her in the way she had worried about. His interest in her had been entirely about the mathematics of debt and leverage, and as long as she was useful and present, she appeared to satisfy whatever equation he had in his head. What he was interested in was business. He had a deal in the works, a major one, from the scraps of conversation she pieced together over the course of those first weeks. He was buying 300 head of cattle from a rancher in the eastern part of the territory, a man whose operation had apparently hit hard times. The price was substantial. There were other parties interested in the same cattle. Crale was maneuvering to be the only buyer at the table when the deal was formalized, and the maneuvering required a trip east to the ranch in question, which would take him away from home for the better part of 2 weeks. He left on a Monday morning with 2 of his men, and the tension in the house dropped like a stone the moment his wagon rounded the bend in the road. Edna Crale sat down in the kitchen with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and for the first time since Kate had arrived, she looked almost like a person instead of a shadow. "He'll be gone until the end of the month," Edna said. "I know," Kate said. Edna looked at her over the rim of her cup. "You're not what he expected," she said. "What did he expect?" "Something easier to frighten." Edna sipped her coffee. "That's not a criticism." Kate sat down across from her. "What do you know about the deal he's working on?" "The cattle purchase in the East." Edna's eyes flickered. She knew something, Kate could see that much. But old habit is hard to break, and Edna Crale had been married to a man who punished the sharing of information for long enough that she closed up again like a morning glory in afternoon shade. "Nothing, that's my business," she said, and that was that. Kate did not push. She had time, and she was starting to have the outlines of a plan. The plan had to do with the paper she carried in the hem of her second dress. The one that said her father's debt was fully settled upon her departure from Crale's employment. The plan had to do with $800 in cattle, and the fact that if the debt could be repaid, she would be free by the terms of the contract Crale himself had written. She needed to understand the cattle deal better. She needed to understand who was on the other end of it. And she needed, somehow, to find a man willing to move 300 head of cattle on terms that would leave her father square. It was a lot to ask. She knew that. But she had grown up watching the cattle trade move through this country, and she knew that opportunity sometimes came in the form of someone else's miscalculation. The answer arrived, as it turned out, in the form of Joel Barnett. He rode in on a Thursday, 12 days after Crale had left for the East, on a bay horse that was just short of spectacular 16 hands, strong through the quarters, with the kind of easy, ground-covering trot that spoke of good breeding and better care. Joel himself was 28 years old, lean without being thin, with dark hair that needed cutting and clear gray eyes that took in everything around him with the kind of steady, unhurried attention that belonged to men who had learned to read the land the way other men read books. He was wearing trail clothes, canvas pants, a worn cotton shirt, boots that had seen considerable miles, and he had the particular straightness of a man who was too tired to slouch but too proud to show it. He asked for water for his horse and himself, which Kate provided from the well. He identified himself as Joel Barnett of the Barnett Cross outfit out of Carson County, and asked if the ranch foreman was available. "Mr. Crale is away on business," Kate said. Joel looked at her steadily. "When's he back?" "End of the month, best estimate." He absorbed this. He looked past her at the buildings and the horse pen and the general lay of the operation, and something in his expression shifted slightly, as though a calculation had come up with an unexpected result. "I see," he said. "Are you here about the cattle deal?" Kate asked. He brought his gaze back to her, and there was something in it, a sharpening, an assessment that was not unfriendly but was definitely careful. "Why would you ask that?" "Because that's the only business Mr. Crale is conducting at the moment that would bring a man from Carson County to this door," Kate said. "And because I have my own interest in that deal, as it happens." There was a silence between them that lasted perhaps 5 seconds but felt considerably longer. Joel Barnett looked at the woman standing beside his horse holding a tin cup of water, and he did something that very few men in Kate's experience had ever done. He actually appeared to consider taking her seriously. "You'd better tell me what your interest is," he said. She told him then, standing in the yard between the well and the barn, with the afternoon sun burning the dusk gold and the horses shifting in the pen. She told him about her father's debt and the paper she was serving under and the mathematics of her situation, laying it out plainly and without drama, because she had never had patience for performance. She told him that she had overheard enough of Crale's conversations to know that the eastern rancher whose cattle Crale was trying to buy was a man named Whitmore, and that Whitmore was being pressured to sell at below-market rates because Crale had somehow gotten ahead of him with the buyers up the trail. She told him that if someone could offer Whitmore a fair price and arrange a competing deal, Crale's maneuver would collapse and Crale would come home with nothing, and there might be enough chaos in the aftermath to produce an opportunity. She did not tell him what she intended to do with the opportunity. Not yet. She did not know him well enough. Joel listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon in that way he had, as though the answer might be visible out there in the distance if he looked hard enough. "Whitmore," he said. "Franklin Whitmore off the Palo Duro tributary." "I believe so." "I know that man," Joel said. "My father ran cattle alongside his for 3 years in the late 60s. Frank Whitmore is a good man who's had a bad run, drought and a family illness from what I heard last." He paused. "How sure are you about Crale pressuring him on the price?" "Sure enough that I'm standing here telling you about it," Kate said. Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. He looked back at her with those gray eyes, and she had the unsettling sensation of being seen quite clearly. "Miss Holloway," she said. "Kate Holloway." "Miss Holloway," he said. "I came to Crale's ranch to talk to him about a different matter, water rights on the South Creek that borders both our ranges. But what you've told me changes things considerably." He looked at her steadily. "If Crale's been undercutting Frank Whitmore, that's the kind of thing that matters to me. And if there's a deal to be offered at a fair price," he stopped. "You have the cattle connections," Kate said. "I know you do, or you wouldn't have come here in the first place talking about range business with Crale. Men who run operations in Carson County have contacts with the Kansas buyers." "You know a lot about the cattle trade for a housekeeper," Joel said. "I know a lot about the cattle trade because I grew up on the edge of it," Kate said, and her voice came out with more heat than she intended. "My father ran Longhorns before his luck turned. I was keeping books before I was 16. And the fact that I'm standing here in an apron does not mean you should discount what I'm telling you." There it was, that not quite smile again, fuller this time, reaching those gray eyes. "No, ma'am," he said. "I can see that." He watered his horse. He accepted a plate of cold beef and cornbread from the kitchen, which he ate at the table in the yard rather than inside, because he was a man who seemed uncomfortable taking anything more than he had asked for. He asked careful questions about what Kate knew of Crale's timeline and his intended offer to Whitmore, and she answered them with the same precision she would have used if he had been asking her about figures in a ledger. By the time the shadows were stretching east, something had been decided between them, not stated in so many words, but understood. Joel Barnett was going to ride east to Frank Whitmore's ranch. He was going to offer Whitmore a fair price for his 300 cattle and arrange connections with buyers in Kansas who were not in Crale's pocket. And Kate Holloway was going to provide him with every piece of information she had. "If this works," Joel said, swinging up onto his bay horse in the last of the afternoon light, "what is it you want out of it, Miss Holloway?" She looked up at him. The light was very good just then, catching the dust in the air and turning everything warm and amber, and she was very aware of how tired she was and how long she had been holding her own weight alone. "I want my father's debt cleared," she said, "and I want out of this arrangement." He nodded. "That's fair." He rode east. She watched him until he was a dark shape on the bright flat distance, and then she went back inside to finish the evening's work, and she told herself the warmth in her chest was nothing more than the first reasonable hope she had felt in months. Edna Crale came to her that night as she was banking the kitchen fire. "I heard you talking to that man," Edna said. Kate straightened and looked at her. She did not try to deny it. "Denton finds out you interfered in his business dealings," Edna said quietly. "It won't go easy for you." "I know," Kate said. Edna studied her for a long moment. In the firelight, the older woman's face was softer than it was in the daylight, the wariness less complete. "The debt on your father's ranch," she said. "What's the exact figure?" $800. That's what Denton told you. Something in the careful flatness of her voice made Kate look at her more sharply. Yes, she said, it's in the contract. The contract he wrote, Edna said. Yes. Edna turned toward the door. Then she stopped, and without looking back, she said, ask your young man to look at the original loan papers, the ones your father signed, and compare the numbers. Then she walked out, and Kate stood very still beside the cooling stove, and thought about what that might mean, and felt the anger inside her tighten another notch. The next 5 days were the longest of Kate's life. She worked. She cooked and cleaned and laundered and went about the ordinary business of the household with the surface calm she had become very good at maintaining, while underneath, her mind was never still. She thought about Joel Barnett riding east across the broken landscape toward Frank Whitmore's ranch, and she thought about what Edna had said about the original loan papers, and she thought about the fact that Crale would return at the end of the month with or without a cattle deal, and she would still be here, still under contract, still waiting. She was not a woman who waited well. She had learned to do it, but she had never learned to like it. On the 6th day, Joel Barnett came back. She heard the horse before she saw him, that same ground-covering trot on the road from the east, and she was already at the door when he rode into the yard. He looked like a man who had been moving hard for several days and had not stopped more than necessary. There was road dust thick on him from hat to boot, and the bay horse had the slightly hollowed look of an animal that had been well used. But his face, when he pulled up at the well and swung down, was carrying something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. Whitmore took the deal, he said. Kate gripped the doorframe. Tell me. He came to the door, and she stepped back to let him in, and they sat at the kitchen table with the evening pressing blue against the windows, and he told her. He had found Frank Whitmore in the condition Kate had predicted, under serious pressure from Crale's maneuvering, with his buyers blocked and his options narrowing. He had offered a fair market price for the 300 cattle, backed by 2 buyers out of Abilene who Joel had personal dealings with and whose word meant something. Whitmore had accepted within the hour. The deal was formalized and witnessed, and the cattle would begin moving north within the week. Crale's going to arrive at Whitmore's ranch and find nothing to buy, Joel said, and come back empty, Kate said. Yes, he looked at her. Now tell me about the loan papers. You mentioned Edna Crale said something about them. She told him. His expression tightened as she spoke, not with anger exactly, but with something colder and more purposeful. He asked her if her father had a copy of the original loan agreement, and she said she believed he did, kept in the tin box under his bed that she had seen her whole childhood and never been invited to examine. Then we need to see that paper, Joel said. My father lives 12 miles north, Kate said. That's not very far. She looked at him. I'm not free to leave this ranch without Crale's permission. That's in the contract I signed. The contract Crale wrote, Joel said, and his voice was quiet, but there was a quality in it that she recognized as the kind of quiet that precedes something considerable. Yes, she said, the one he wrote. He was silent for a moment. Then, Miss Holloway, do you believe that contract is binding under Texas law if it was based on a fraudulent debt figure? She had not thought about it in exactly those terms. She thought about it now. She was not a lawyer, but she had a good mind, and she had grown up hearing the edges of legal conversations whenever men gathered to argue about range boundaries and water rights, and she understood enough to know that a contract built on a false number was not a sound contract. No, she said slowly. I don't believe it would be. Neither do I, he said. He stayed the night in the barn. She offered the spare room, but he declined with a quiet courtesy that she found she liked, a kind of thoughtfulness about propriety that was not stuffy but was genuine. In the morning they rode north to her father's place, Kate on Crale's most docile working horse, which she saddled herself without asking anyone's permission, because she had decided that certain small acts of autonomy were worth whatever consequence they might bring. Silas Holloway opened his door at 9 in the morning looking like a man who had been sleeping badly for months, which was accurate. He was gaunt and gray, and the guilt on his face when he saw his daughter was the worst thing Kate had seen in recent memory, worse than anything Crale had done, because this was her father and he had done this to her and they both knew it. She did not say anything about that. She asked for the tin box. He brought it from under the bed, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table, the same table she had sat at as a girl, learning to read by firelight, and Joel Barnett laid out the original loan documents beside the contract from the saloon, and they read them together. The original loan had been for $650, not $800. The difference was there in the numbers, plain as the nose on a man's face, if you knew to look for it. The original paper showed $650. The contract Kate had signed at the saloon stated $800 as the debt figure. $150 had been added to the debt between the time Silas signed the loan and the time Crale produced the collateral contract. $150 that Silas, a man who was not good with numbers and trusted the documentation of other people more than he trusted his own memory, had not caught. Kate sat with the two papers in her hands and felt the rage move through her like a weather front, clean and enormous and strangely calming, the way very large feelings sometimes are when they finally have a fact to attach themselves to. "He defrauded you," Joel said to Silas. His voice was even and clear. "The debt isn't $800. It never was." Silas stared at the papers. He looked as though the floor had shifted beneath him. I thought the saloon, I had a drink or two, and he produced the papers and the drink was intentional," Kate said. She was surprised by how steady her own voice was. "He needed you impaired enough not to do the arithmetic." Silas put his face in his hands. Joel reached across the table and picked up both papers carefully, folding them together. He looked at Kate, and the steadiness in his gray eyes was something she found herself enormously grateful for just then, not soft, not pitying, just present and competent and clear. "The actual debt is $650, he said. "That's a figure I can work with." "What does that mean?" Kate asked. "It means I'd like to purchase the debt from Crale," Joel said. "At the real figure, which he'll have no choice but to accept because the original loan paper is sitting right here. It means I'd like your father to repay me over the course of the coming year at no interest, because I have no use for interest and it would complicate the paperwork. And it means that your contract with Crale, which was based on a fraudulent debt figure, is void." There was a silence in the small kitchen. Outside, a cardinal was singing in the mesquite. The morning was clear and warm and smelled of dust and wildflowers, the way the Panhandle smelled in late spring. "Why would you do that?" Kate asked. Joel looked at her very directly. "Because it's right," he said. Then, after a moment, "and because I've been trying to find a reason to keep talking to you." The heat that came to her face was mortifying. She was not a woman who blushed easily, and the fact that she was blushing now over a simple, honest statement from a man she had known for less than 2 weeks was not something she would have predicted about herself. She turned toward the window so he couldn't see it. "You hardly know me," she said. "I know enough," he said. "But I'm in no rush, Miss Holloway. We'll settle the legal matter first." They returned to Crale's ranch that afternoon, and Kate told Edna what had been found in the original loan papers. Edna Crale listened without expression, but something in her went still in a particular way. The stillness of a person hearing confirmation of something they have known for a long time but were never able to prove. She went to the locked chest in the study and returned with a small stack of papers tied with cord, which she set on the kitchen table without comment. "Those are the other arrangements like yours," she said. "I've counted 3 in the past 4 years. The papers are all in that bundle." Kate understood immediately. Denton Crale had done this before. Other families, other desperate debts, other women or properties handed over as collateral against figures that had been quietly inflated. She looked at the bundle of papers and felt something enormous and complicated move through her. "Will you testify to this?" Joel asked Edna quietly. Edna Crale looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Kate. Then she looked at the window, through which the empty yard of the ranch she had lived in for 20 years was visible in the afternoon light. "Yes," she said, "I believe I will." Denton Crale returned from the east 3 days later, earlier than expected, and in a state that made his men give him a wide berth in the yard. He had arrived at Whitmore's ranch to find the deal already completed, his leverage gone, his buyers unreachable, and Frank Whitmore politely unmoved. He had ridden home in a fury that had not diminished with the miles. He walked into his house to find Kate Holloway sitting at his kitchen table with Joel Barnett beside her, and a county official named Hargrove, the justice of the peace from Tascosa, a thin elderly man with impeccable posture and an expression of mild, permanent disapproval sitting across from them with a spread of documents on the table. Crale stopped in the doorway. "Mr. Crale," Hargrove said, in the manner of a man who had been waiting and was prepared, "please come in and sit down. There are several matters requiring your attention." The next 2 hours were the most satisfying Kate Holloway had ever experienced in a room. Hargrove laid it out with the methodical precision of a man who had been keeping the peace in this country for 30 years and was not impressed by any individual piece of it. The discrepancy in the loan figures. The other papers from Edna's bundle, which showed a pattern consistent and clear. The contract Kate had signed, which Hargrove declared void on the grounds of the fraudulent debt figure. The legal requirement that Crale accept the true amount of Silas Holloway's debt, $650, from the party now holding the debt assignment, which was Joel Barnett. Crale tried several things during this process. He tried bluster, and Hargrove did not blink. He tried denial, and the original loan papers were placed in front of him. He tried the suggestion that his wife's testimony was not credible, and Edna, sitting in the chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap, looked at him with the calm of a woman who had decided something irreversible and said simply, "The papers speak for themselves, Denton." He tried at the end to look at Kate Holloway in a way that was meant to be intimidating, and Kate looked back at him with the clearest, most level gaze she had and said nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said. Hargrove had him sign the debt transfer paper and the formal release of Kate's contract before witnesses. He informed Crale that the matter of the other fraudulent arrangements would require a formal hearing within the month, and that his presence was legally required at that hearing. He gathered his papers, thanked Edna for the water she had provided him, and left. The whole thing had the quality of a dream, not a soft dream, but one of the vivid, airless ones that feel more real than waking life. When Hargrove and his deputy were gone and the sound of their horses had faded down the road, Kate stood up from the table. Her legs were steady, which pleased her. She walked to the room off the kitchen, and she took her trunk out from under the cot, and she lifted her second dress from the hook, and she put both in the small cart that Joel had brought for exactly this purpose, because he had thought of it without being asked, and that struck her as the kind of thing worth noticing about a person. She went to say goodbye to Edna. Edna was standing in the kitchen doorway looking out at the yard. When Kate came up beside her, the older woman turned and looked at her with those eyes that had learned to hold nothing, except that now they were holding something after all. Not happiness exactly, something more like the distant beginning of relief. "You'll be all right," Kate said. "I will," Edna said, and the steadiness in her voice was new and real. "There's a sister in San Antonio I haven't written to in 12 years. I think I'll write to her." Kate put her hand over Edna's for a moment. Then she picked up her trunk and walked out into the afternoon sun. Joel was waiting beside the cart with both horses hitched. He said nothing as she loaded the trunk, just held the cart horse steady and then offered her a hand up onto the seat. She took it, a brief, warm clasp, his hand calloused and certain, and settled herself on the board. He climbed up beside her and they drove north toward her father's house, and for a good while neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that two people only achieve when they have been through something real together. Finally Kate said, "The $650, paid in full to Crale," Joel said. "He has no further claim on your father's ranch." My father will repay you. He will, Joel agreed. Over 12 months, as I said, no interest. I'll draw up the paper tonight if you like. I'd like, Kate said. Another mile passed. The light was going golden now, that particular late afternoon golden that happened over the Panhandle and turned the dry grass into something that looked almost like a painting. Why do you ranch in Carson County? Kate asked. It was not the question she was thinking about, but it was a reasonable place to start. My father's ranch, Joel said. He died 6 years ago and I've been running it since. Decent land, good water from the creek. We run about 400 head. You do that alone. 2 good hands and a cook who's been with us since before I was born, he said. And a neighbor woman who keeps the books on Fridays. But mostly, yes. He glanced at her sideways. You said you kept books before you were 16. I did. Our books are in a state, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her smile despite herself, the studied casualness of someone raising a subject they've been thinking about for a while. Is that a job offer, Mr. Barnett? It's a possibility, he said. Among other things, he paused. I don't want to be forward. You've been remarkably unforward for a man who just settled my father's fraudulent debt, Kate said. I think you can afford to be slightly more forward, he laughed. It was a genuine laugh, and it transformed his face completely. The gravity of it broke open into something warm and unguarded and years younger, and Kate felt the warmth in her chest again, the same warmth she had felt watching him ride east toward Whitmore's ranch, and this time she did not try to tell herself it was something other than what it was. I was thinking, he said, when the laugh had settled back into that steady quiet, that Carson County is not so far from Tascosa. No, Kate agreed, it's not, and that I'll be passing through here fairly regularly over the coming year on account of the debt repayment arrangements with your father. That's quite convenient, Kate said. I thought so, he said. They arrived at her father's house as the sun was touching the horizon, and Silas Holloway came out onto the porch and looked at his daughter stepping down from the cart, free and upright and clear-eyed. And the relief on his face was so complete that it cracked something open in Kate that she hadn't expected. She was still angry with him. She would be angry for a while yet, and they both knew it. But he was her father and he was old, and he was standing on his porch looking at her as though he had been given something back that he had been sure was gone forever. She walked up onto the porch and she let him take her hands and she said, "We need to talk, Papa." Properly, all of it, her voice was firm. "But not tonight. Tonight I'm home and that's enough." He nodded. His eyes were very bright. Joel stayed for supper, sitting at the same table where they had read the loan papers that morning, eating Silas's simple cooking with the same easy courtesy he brought to everything, asking Silas careful questions about the ranch and the herd and the year's prospects, and asking in a way that was not pity but genuine interest. And Kate watched from across the table as her father straightened slightly in his chair and began to talk about the land the way he used to talk about it, before the debt had bent him down. When the meal was done, Joel stepped outside to see to the horses, and Kate stood in the kitchen washing the tin plates and thinking about the fact that this man had ridden into Crale's yard 12 days ago and changed the entire shape of her life, and that she had not asked for his help, and he had not offered it out of pity but out of something that looked very much like rightness. The recognition that a wrong thing was happening, and that he happened to be in a position to make it right. That was different from rescue. She was clear on that distinction. He had not rescued her. She had already done most of her own rescuing by the time he arrived, with $4.30 sewn in her hem and a second contract in her pocket and enough nerve to stand in a yard and tell a stranger the truth about what was happening in plain, unflinching terms. He had simply been the person who had been willing to hear it. That was different. That was worth something. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I'll be heading out," he said. "Long ride back." "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate and she knew it. He looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes and then he nodded. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I'll be back through in 3 weeks or so." "I'll be here," she said. He left. She listened to the sound of his horse until it faded into the enormous night, and then she went to bed in her own room in her father's house, in her own bed, and she lay looking up at the ceiling and thinking that 3 weeks was not very long. The formal hearing for Denton Crale's fraudulent practices was held 6 weeks later in Tascosa, in the county building that served as courthouse and meeting hall and occasional church depending on what the week required. Kate attended with her father, who had spent the preceding weeks in a state of mortified diligence mending fence, clearing brush, working the land with the focused energy of a man trying to pay back more than a financial debt. Joel Barnett attended as a witness. Denton Crale attended with her lawyer, a sharp-faced woman from Amarillo named Mrs. Prescott, which caused a considerable stir in the room because female lawyers were not common anywhere in Texas in 1873 and were particularly uncommon in Tascosa County. But Mrs. Prescott appeared entirely indifferent to the stir. The hearing lasted most of a day. Hargrove presided with the same dry precision he had brought to the kitchen in Crale's house. The evidence was presented, the original loan papers, the contract discrepancies, the other cases from Edna's bundle, testimony from 2 of the other families who had been similarly defrauded. Joel gave his account of the Whitmore situation. Edna gave her testimony in the same flat, careful voice she used for most things, but her account was exact and specific and impossible to dismiss. Crale's lawyer argued several things, none of them particularly persuasively. Crale himself sat at the table with the careful stillness of a man who has decided that performance of any kind will hurt more than help, which was perhaps the most intelligent decision he had made in the entire proceeding. The judgment, when it came down at the end of the afternoon, was what it should have been. Crale was required to make full restitution to the 3 families whose debts had been inflated, including formal cancellation of Kate Holloway's remaining debt obligation to Joel Barnett. The original $650 was declared fraudulent from the beginning, which meant Kate owed nothing at all, which meant Joel was out $650, and seemed genuinely unbothered by this fact. Crale was fined additionally by the county, the sum to go toward public funds. The fraudulent contracts were formally voided. A separate criminal matter regarding property fraud was referred to the district court in Amarillo. Kate sat in the gallery and listened to all of this, and when it was done and the room was breaking up into the hum of voices and the scrape of chairs, she found Joel beside her without being quite sure when he had moved from the witness table to the gallery. "It's done," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. Her voice was very steady. She had spent the last 6 weeks being steady. She was good at it. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like something that's been tight for a long time has come loose," she said. "It's strange. It's good, but it's strange." "That sounds right," he said. They walked out of the courthouse together into the late afternoon, into the dust and the noise and the smell of horses and wood smoke that constituted the entirety of Tascosa's civic life. Kate had gone ahead to speak to Hargrove about some additional paper. The street was full of the ordinary commotion of a late afternoon, a wagon from the general store, 2 boys chasing a dog, the piano from the saloon beginning its early evening work. "I want to show you something," Joel said. She looked at him. "What?" "The ranch," he said. "Carson County, I want you to see it." He paused, and there it was again, that studied casualness that she had come to recognize as his version of feeling something significant. "I've been riding down here every 3 weeks for the reasons I told you, which were true, but there's another reason." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said again, more quietly. "I've known for a while. And I have my own feelings about it that I've been trying to figure out how to tell you, because telling people things directly is something I do in business, but apparently harder when it's something else." She stopped. A horse went by at a trot, kicking up a brief cloud of dust. "I'd like to see the ranch," she said. "Very much." He smiled then, that full, genuine smile that changed everything about his face, and she thought that she could very easily spend a long time looking at that smile. "Next week?" he asked. "Next week," she agreed. The ride to Carson County took a full day and a half on horseback, through country that was by turns flat and broken, all under a sky of that specific deep blue that the Texas Panhandle wore in late spring. Kate rode her father's second horse, a solid gray named General whom she had been riding since she was 14, and Joel rode his bay, and they talked for most of the journey, about the country they were passing through, about the cattle trade and the politics of the trails, about the families they had come from, and the things those families had given them, and the things they had not. It was the kind of conversation that happens when two people have decided to stop being careful about what they reveal, and it had the quality of something being built, one word at a time, solid and deliberate and strong. She learned that Joel's mother had died when he was 12, and that he had largely raised himself from that point under the nominal supervision of his father, who was a good man but a man who was more comfortable with cattle than with people, and who had taught Joel everything about running land and almost nothing about running relationships, which was a gap Joel was clearly still working on filling. She learned that he had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman from Amarillo, and that the engagement had ended because she had wanted a life in the city, and he had been constitutionally incapable of wanting that. He told this story without apparent bitterness, which she noted. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever when Kate was 9, and about growing up as her father's only companion on a working ranch, which had made her capable in ways that surprised most people and isolated her in ways she had never quite figured out how to explain. "You figured out how to explain it to me," Joel said. "You're easier to talk to than most people," she said. "Is that a compliment?" he asked. "It's an observation," she said, "which with me is the higher category." He laughed again, and she decided that making him laugh was something she wanted to keep doing for as long as he'd let her. The Barnett Ranch appeared in the late afternoon of the second day, rising out of the spring grass in the way good land appeared when it was well cared for, not imposing, not dramatic, but settled and sound. It was more prosperous than it had looked in her imagination, a comfortable sprawl of buildings in good repair set against a low ridge with a clear creek running 50 yards to the south. The main house was timber frame and adobe, larger than she had expected, with a wide porch that faced south and a kitchen garden alongside the east wall that was currently in a state of enthusiastic and somewhat overgrown spring growth. A woman of perhaps 60 came out of the kitchen door and leaned on the porch railing and looked at them with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular arrival for longer than just today. "That's me," Joel said, with a slight shift in his voice that told Kate everything she needed to know about what me meant to him. "She's been cooking here since before I was born. She'll want to feed you immediately." "I'm very open to that," Kate said. Me turned out to be a compact, brown-skinned woman with gray hair and bright dark eyes, and the kind of energy that suggested she had never in her life allowed herself to be idle. She shook Kate's hand with a grip like a rancher and said, "About time," which made Joel's ears turn red in a way that Kate found entirely charming. "Me," Joel said, in the tone of a man trying to redirect a conversation. "The guest room is ready," Me said, unbothered. "Supper in an hour. Steak and potatoes. I've been saving the good cut." Kate stayed 3 days. She saw the whole operation, the 400 cattle spread across the spring grass, the creek with its clear cold water and the cottonwoods shading both banks, the south pasture where Joel was planning to expand, the north fence line that needed the next summer's work. She spent an afternoon with the ranch's account books, which were indeed in a state, not disastrously, but there were months of disorganized entries and some creative interpretations of which column was which that made her want to roll up her sleeves and stay for a week. "This is correctable," she said, sitting at the desk in the small ranch office on the second afternoon, surrounded by ledger pages. "Not terrible, but it needs a system." "I don't have a system," Joel admitted. He was leaning in the doorframe, watching her work with an expression she caught out of the corner of her eye that she filed away carefully, attentive and warm, and something else, something that made her concentrate harder on the ledger pages than was strictly necessary. "I can see that," she said. "Your May entries are in the June column, and you've been subtracting your supply costs from the wrong line for about 8 months. Is it bad? It means you're $12 ahead of where you thought you were, she said. So the news is good, but you need a system. Would you be willing to set one up? He asked. She put the pen down and turned in her chair to look at him. He was watching her with that attentiveness, the afternoon light falling through the office window and making the whole room warm and golden, and she was very conscious of the smallness of the room and the fact that they were alone in it. "Joel," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to say something directly. I'd expect nothing less." She took a breath. "I'm not going to come and work for you as a bookkeeper. I'm not interested in an employment arrangement. I just spent 3 months as someone's contractual property, and I don't intend to enter into another situation where my presence here is justified by what I produce for the household." She paused. "That's not what I want." He was very still in the doorway. His face was open, unguarded in a way that she had come to recognize meant he was paying full attention. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want to know if what you're working up to is what I think it is," she said. "Because if it is, then yes. And if it isn't, then I need to go home and reorganize my understanding of this situation." There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and felt considerably longer. And then Joel Barnett walked across the small room and stood directly in front of her and said, in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, "I want you to stay here because you want to be here. Not because I need a bookkeeper. Because I would like very much for you to be my wife." The late spring afternoon was completely silent around them. Outside, somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek, a meadowlark was singing. "All right," Kate said. He blinked. "All right." "Yes," she said. And then, because she was Kate Holloway, and she had never in her life been capable of simplicity when something needed to be said fully, "I have been telling myself for 6 weeks that the reason I kept thinking about you was because you were the first man in recent memory to treat me like a person capable of making my own decisions. And that is partly true. But the actual reason is that you are the most decent and clear-eyed and genuinely good person I have met in a very long time, and I would like very much to be here. So yes." He reached out and took her hand very carefully, the way someone handles something they value considerably, and the warmth of it went all the way up her arm and into her chest where it settled like something finding its right place. Then he smiled, that full, genuine, transforming smile, and she felt the answering warmth in her own face, and she stopped trying to be careful about it. He kissed her for the first time in the small office with the ranch ledgers spread on the desk around them, and the meadowlark singing outside. And it was exactly what a first kiss ought to be, unhurried and certain, and full of the sense of something beginning properly, rather than accidentally. "They told me that evening at the supper table, and me put down her fork and said, 'Finally,' with the satisfaction of a woman who had been proven right about something she was entirely certain of, and Joel's ears went red again, and Kate laughed so genuinely and freely that she surprised herself. The wedding was planned for September, which gave them the summer to arrange things properly. Kate went home to her father's house for June and July, and the two of them had the long-overdue conversations that they had been circling since the night at the saloon. They were not easy conversations. Silas Holloway was a man with a great deal to answer for, and he knew it, and the knowing of it had made him in some ways more honest than he had been when the guilt was still a thing he could avoid. He told Kate things she had not known, about the years after her mother died, about the slow accumulation of poor decisions and poorer luck, about the fear that had driven him to Crale's table, and the moment he had known, even as he signed the paper, that he was doing something he would not be able to undo. Kate listened to all of it without making it easy for him, because making it easy would have been dishonest, and they had both had enough of dishonesty. But she listened without cruelty either, because he was her father and he was old, and the guilt had cost him considerably already, and because she had a future ahead of her that was bright enough to illuminate the past without being consumed by it. By the end of July, They had reached something that was not forgiveness, yet forgiveness would take longer, but was a real and solid truce, a beginning of the slow work of repair. Silas had started working the ranch with a focused purposefulness that reminded Kate of the man he had been before the debt had ground him down. He had written to 2 neighboring ranchers about a cooperative arrangement for the fall roundup. He had fixed the fence line along the south pasture that had been broken since the previous winter. He was, slowly and imperfectly, trying to become the man the land needed him to be again. Joel rode down 3 times over the summer, staying 2 nights each time, eating supper with Silas, and talking about cattle and weather, and the coming season with the natural ease of a man who was good at making his intentions clear without requiring any kind of performance. Silas took to him with the slightly dazed gratitude of a man who knows he does not deserve the good thing that is happening to his family, but intends to honor it anyway. On Joel's second visit, Kate walked with him in the evening along the shallow creek south of the property, in the last of the summer light that turned the water bronze and the grass silver. They walked without talking for a while, their shoulders nearly touching, the evening settling around them with the particular richness of summer evenings in that country. The air smelled of heat and creek water and the distant sweetness of the wildflowers that came up every year along the bank. "Are you sure about September?" Joel asked. She glanced at him. "Are you nervous?" "Not nervous," he said. "Careful, I want to make sure it's right for you." "It is right for me," she said. "I've been thinking clearly about it for months and it continues to be right. I'm not a person who makes decisions out of impulse." "No," he said, smiling. "I've noticed that. September is good," she said. "It'll be cooler and the cattle work will slow down and your hands will be able to come to the wedding without missing anything critical." He took her hand as they walked, and she threaded her fingers through his and felt the simple, solid rightness of it. "I've been thinking about the house," he said. "The south bedroom gets the morning light. I thought you might want to use the small room by the office for a study." "You thought about that," she said. "I thought about a lot of things," he said. "You'll need a good desk. The one in the office is drafty in winter. Me says there's a good cabinet maker in Amarillo." Kate stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "Joel," she said. "Yes." "Stop planning out loud and look at me for a moment." He turned toward her, and in the bronze evening light his face was very serious and very open, and she put her free hand against his face and felt him go very still, and she said, "I love you," without preamble or qualification, because she did, and because she was Kate Holloway, and when she knew something she said it. His expression did something complicated and wonderful, a softening, a release, like a man setting down a weight he didn't realize he'd been carrying. "I love you," he said. "I've been wanting to say that for months and I kept deciding it was too soon." "It wasn't too soon," she said. "It was the right pace, but now it's said." He smiled. He drew her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the old-fashioned courtly way that seemed incongruous in a man in trail-worn boots and canvas pants, but suited him perfectly. "September, then," he said. "September," she agreed. The wedding took place on the 14th of September, 1873, in the small white church in Tascosa on a day of brilliant early autumn clarity, when the sky was the exact color of blue that had no name sufficient for it. Silas Holloway walked his daughter down the aisle with the careful formality of a man who is determined to do at least this one thing perfectly right. Me had come up from Carson County and was sitting in the front pew looking both emotional and satisfied in roughly equal measure. Joel's 2 ranch hands, a quiet Texan named Durham, and a young man of Mexican heritage named Rodrigo who had been with the ranch for 2 years, sat in the third row looking freshly combed and slightly uncomfortable in their Sunday shirts. Hargrove, the justice of the peace, performed the ceremony, which Kate had requested be kept brief. It was. The vows were simple and direct and meant every word, and when Joel looked at her while he said them, she thought she had never been looked at quite so thoroughly and honestly in all her life, and she looked back in kind. After, there was a small gathering at the church hall, ham and cornbread, and Me's apple cake, which was apparently legendary among anyone who had ever eaten it. People from Tascosa and from Carson County filled the room, and it occurred to Kate, looking around the hall, that she was now connected to a community of people in a way she had not been for a very long time, not since her mother's death had made her father pull inward, and the family had gradually contracted to just the two of them against the land. She danced with Joel in the church hall to the fiddle music of a rancher from the north of the county, who turned out to have genuine talent. And she found that dancing with Joel was natural in the same way that everything with Joel was natural, like a thing that fit because it was the right shape and had always been. Near the end of the evening, she stood at the hall's door with a cup of cider, watching the gathering wind down and the autumn evening settle over Tascosa, and she thought about the night 8 months ago when she had stood in the alley behind the saloon listening to a mockingbird and trying to find her options. $4.30 sewn in her hem. A contract she had not chosen, a father who had failed her, and she had stood there in the alley and she had refused to break. The refusing had mattered, but so had Joel riding into the yard, not because he had saved her. He had said himself that she had done most of her own work, but because the world, which was so often indifferent or actively cruel, had also produced this man careful and decent and clear-eyed and genuinely good, and had sent him down the road to Crale's ranch on a Thursday afternoon on a bay horse just short of spectacular. That was worth being grateful for. She was. Joel appeared beside her, 2 cups of cider in his hands, and gave her one and looked out at the evening alongside her. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Home, Carson County. The ranch with the creek and the cottonwoods and me's kitchen and the office with the badly organized ledgers and the south bedroom with the morning light." "Yes," she said, "very ready." They left the next morning at first light, the wagon loaded with Kate's things and a few pieces of furniture Silas had insisted she take, and Silas himself standing on his porch watching them go with an expression that was still complicated but was more peace than guilt now, which was an improvement. Kate leaned from the wagon and took her father's hand for a moment, and he squeezed it without speaking, and she said, "Come visit in the spring. Bring the gray if he's up to the ride." "I will," Silas said. His voice was thick. "I will, Kate." She let go and faced forward, and Joel clicked the horses into motion, and the road to Carson County unrolled ahead of them in the early autumn morning. The weeks that followed were the business of building a life together, which is both simpler and more complex than any story about it can quite capture. Kate took over the ranch accounts with a thoroughness that had Durham raising his eyebrows and Rodrigo looking at her, with the particular respect of a young man encountering someone genuinely competent for the first time. She redesigned the filing system in the office, established a proper monthly record, and by the end of October had the books in a state that would make any potential buyer or banker feel immediately confident, which she told Joel was purely practical. "You love it," Joel said, watching her label a new ledger with the careful printing she had developed for documents. "I do," she admitted. "Numbers have a clarity that people rarely manage, present company included." "You're better than most," she said generously. She also took on the kitchen garden, which had been alive but barely, Me's age making the heavier work more difficult. The two of them worked it together in the fall, clearing the overgrown beds and planting the cool season vegetables that would carry them through the early winter. And in the working alongside each other, Kate began to understand Me the way you only understand someone through the particular language of shared labor. Me had been born a free woman in East Texas, the daughter of freedmen who had managed to hold a small piece of land through sheer determination and legal knowledge. And she had come to the Barnett Ranch as a young woman because Joel's father had been one of the few men who had offered her honest wages and treated her honestly. And she had stayed because she had decided the place suited her, and what Me decided was final. She had raised Joel in every way that mattered after his mother died, and she had opinions about most things and shared them freely, and Kate found that she liked this about Me enormously. November brought the first cold and the last of the fall cattle work, and Joel was gone for long stretches managing the roundup and sorting, and Kate ran the domestic end of the operation with an efficiency that had even me looking at her with approval. She corresponded with her father weekly, and his letters back were gradually less stiff and more like the man she remembered from her childhood, curious about the land, full of small observations about the weather and the wildlife, asking careful questions about the Barnett operation that told her he was studying a different way of doing things. In December, on a cold, clear evening with the first real freeze cracking the creek ice, Kate told Joel that she thought she might be expecting a child. She told him quietly, in the kitchen after supper, with the fire burning and the wind coming down from the north and rattling the window glass, and she watched his face move through several things very quickly: surprise, then a warm, spreading certainty, then something that was simply love and nothing more complicated. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Sure enough to tell you," she said. "Which is sure enough?" He came around the table and put his hands on her face as she had put her hands on his that evening by the creek in August, with the same careful handling of something valued, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and then he said, "You have made my life significantly larger and better than it was before you were in it, Kate Barnett." "Holloway Barnett," she said. He smiled. "Holloway Barnett," he agreed. "They told me in the morning." Me sat down in the kitchen chair and put her hands over her mouth for a moment, and her eyes were very bright. Then she stood up, rolled up her sleeves, and began planning a breakfast large enough for a celebration, and Kate laughed and Joel sat at the table looking at the two women he was sharing his life with and appeared to be the happiest he had ever been. The winter passed in the way of good winters, slow and quiet and full of small interior warmth. Kate's letters to her father grew more frequent, and his returns more animated. He came for Christmas with General, the gray horse, and 3 days in Carson County did something visibly good for him, being off his own land and among different people, and at the table of people who were happy seemed to remind him that the world was larger than the perimeter of his own guilt. He and Joel spent an afternoon walking the south pasture, talking about cattle and the spring grass prospects, and when they came back in for supper, there was something in her father's bearing that was more upright than she had seen in years. On Christmas evening, after me had gone to bed and Joel was checking on the horses, Kate sat with Silas in the parlor by the fire, and they talked quietly about her mother. It was the first time in years they had done this, simply talked about her, not around her, and it was painful in the way that necessary things sometimes are, and then it was something else, something lighter and more whole, and Silas fell asleep in his chair before the fire burned down, and Kate covered him with a blanket and felt a kind of peace that had been a long time coming. In late January, a letter arrived from Tascosa. It was from the county court, relaying the outcome of the district proceedings against Denton Crale in Amarillo. The fraud charges had resulted in a significant financial judgment. Crale's ranch was to be sold at auction to satisfy the restitution requirements. 3 families, including Silas Holloway, received formal notification that their fraudulent debt agreements were nullified, and that a portion of the auction proceeds would be distributed to those affected by his scheme. Silas's share, after the math was done, came to several $100s, not a fortune, but enough to put him soundly on good footing for the coming year. Kate read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then she set it down and looked out the window at the January morning, at the bare cottonwoods along the creek and the cold, clear sky. Joel came in from the barn, stamping mud from his boots at the door, and she handed him the letter without a word. He read it and looked up at her. "It's done," she said. "It is," he said. "Good," she said, and meant it completely. Not with anger or triumph, but with the simple satisfaction of a chapter closed properly. It was done. Denton Crale and his fraudulent ledgers and his stone-faced ranch and his small, calculating eyes belonged to the past now, and the past was where they could leave it. She wrote to Edna Crale that afternoon, not a long letter, but a genuine one. She told her that she hoped the proceeding had given her the means to leave. She told her about her marriage and the coming child, and that she thought of her sometimes with real gratitude, that the thing Edna had done in producing those papers and offering her testimony had required more courage than most people were asked for, and that she had delivered it perfectly. She wished her well in San Antonio with her sister. She signed it Kate Holloway Barnett. A reply came 6 weeks later. Edna was in San Antonio. Her sister had received her. She was well. The letter was short and careful, but there was something in it, a quality of air, Kate thought, the way certain letters smell of the space the writer is in. San Antonio smelled of warmth and possibility. The baby was born in July of 1874, on a morning of brilliant summer heat when the creek was low, and the cicadas were making their enormous noise in the cottonwoods. It was a boy strong and square-jawed and deeply serious in the manner of newborns who are already assessing their situation. Joel sat on the edge of the bed and held him with the careful, enormous concentration of a new father, and the baby looked up at him with dark eyes that didn't know anything yet but seemed entirely willing to learn. "William," Kate said. They had agreed on the name in March. "William," Joel said, in a voice she had never heard from him before, lower, rougher, stunned through with something that had no smaller word than love. Me stood in the doorway of the bedroom and pressed her hand to her mouth again in the way she had done when Kate had first told her about the pregnancy. And then she went away to make tea and very likely to have a good cry in the kitchen where nobody would see it, which was her prerogative. Silas came for the summer, arriving a week after William's birth with a horse load of goods and the look of a man who has been renovated by purpose. He stayed 2 months, and the sight of him holding his grandson in the evenings on the south-facing porch was something Kate found herself storing carefully in the part of her mind that holds things worth keeping. He was gentler than he had been, or perhaps more accurately, he had returned to the gentleness he had possessed before the years of hard luck and whiskey and wrong decisions had covered it over. The land and the debt had taken a great deal from him, but they had not taken everything, and what remained was worth having. He left in September to return to his own ranch for the fall work, and Kate walked out to the road with him and watched him saddle General, and watched the gray horse's ears come forward with the anticipation of a horse that knows it's going home. "Kate," Silas said from the saddle. She looked up at him. "I know it isn't sufficient," he said. "What I said in the summer and what I said at Christmas, saying it isn't the same as being it." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But I'm trying to be it," he said. "Every day. I wanted you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment, at her father, old and gray-haired and finally, slowly trying. She thought about the mockingbird in the cottonwood tree outside the Dusty Fork Saloon on the night her world had contracted to $4.30. She thought about the anger she had felt, the rage that was clean and enormous. She thought about all the distance between that night and this morning. "I know, Papa," she said. "Come back at Christmas. Bring the gray." He rode north. She went back inside, where William was fussing in Me's arms and Joel was in the office doing something inadvisable to the October accounts that she would need to fix in the morning, and the fire in the kitchen was warm, and the creek outside was low and silver in the September light. 2 more years passed with the particular speed of years that are full. The ranch grew. Joel bought the South Pasture addition he had been planning since before Kate arrived, expanding the operation to 550 head. Kate's bookkeeping became the bedrock of the financial planning, and she branched into a correspondence arrangement with 2 other ranches in the county, whose accounts were in various states of chaos, because it turned out that good bookkeeping was genuinely rare in that country and people were willing to pay for it in a way that suited her considerably. She was not, she thought, built to sit still, and the combination of ranch life and the small but real professional work of the accounts suited her in a way that full domesticity alone never would have. William grew with the uncanny speed of small children, from the solemn-eyed infant into a toddler of determined energy who had his father's steady attention, and his mother's absolute refusal to be impressed by anything he hadn't verified personally. He could say Me's name before he could say anything else, which caused a warmth in the old woman that was almost painful to witness. In the spring of 1876, Kate found herself expecting again, and this time she told Joel on the porch in the morning, with the creek running high from the spring rains and William asleep inside and the day barely begun. "Another one," Joel said, not quite a question. "Another one," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good, just that." But the way he said it, with that particular quality of Joel quiet that contained more than most people managed with a full speech, it was sufficient. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1876, when the first real cold of the season was settling over Carson County, and the cattle were fat on the summer's good grass, and everything about the operation was in a state of solid, working rightness. They named her Clara, after Joel's mother, and she was born with dark auburn hair exactly the color of Kate's, and from the very first hour had an expression of serene and implacable intention that made me laugh until she had to sit down. "That's your child," Joel told Kate on the first evening, with Clara asleep on his chest in the way that newborns instinctively find the warmest and most comfortable arrangement. "She has your ears," Kate said. "She has your everything else," Joel said, "including the look that says she's already decided something and is just waiting for you to figure out what it is." Kate leaned against him on the narrow edge of the bed, looking at their daughter's sleeping face, and felt the fullness of it, the weight and the warmth and the realness of this life that had been built from the wreckage of a collateral contract and a fraudulent debt figure, and a man who had ridden into a yard on a bay horse and been willing to listen. "Joel," she said, "do you ever think about the day you rode into Crale's yard?" He was quiet for a moment. Clara breathed in the slow, perfect rhythm of the utterly unconscious. "Sometimes," he said, "not often. What do you think about it?" "I think about you standing at that well," he said, "holding a tin cup of water, looking at me like you were already running the arithmetic on whether I was worth talking to." She smiled. "You passed." "Barely," he said. "I could tell." "You passed adequately," she allowed, "and then incrementally better as time went on." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the warm lamplight with their daughter between them, while the first November wind found the edges of the house, and the creek outside ran dark and cold, and the lights of the ranch were the only lights for a long way in any direction. And it was enough, more than enough. It was the right size for a life. Silas Holloway visited at Christmas that year and held Clara with the particular reverence of a grandfather holding a granddaughter for the first time, and William climbed onto his lap alongside, and Silas sat with both grandchildren and looked at the fire, and then looked at Kate across the room with eyes that were very bright in something else, something that had finally, after all this time, made its peace. He died in the spring of 1879, quietly, of a heart that had been worked hard for too long, in his bed in the house on the Llano Estacado. Kate had been with him for the last week. She held his hand at the end and told him that the land was his and would be remembered, and he went out on a clear May morning with the sound of the Panhandle wind in the window glass and a cardinal singing in the mesquite outside. She cried then, finally, deeply, the way she had not cried at the saloon when he had handed her over like a debt payment, the way she had not cried in Crale's kitchen or in the county courthouse or on the long wagon ride north the morning after the wedding. She cried because he was her father and he had failed her and had spent the last years of his life trying to make up for it, and had not quite made it all the way through before the time ran out, and because that was the shape of human things and there was no way around it. Joel came as soon as her letter reached him, leaving the ranch in Durham's capable hands for a week, and he buried Silas Holloway alongside Kate's mother in the small cemetery on the edge of the property, and he stood beside Kate and held her hand, and he did not say anything because he understood that she did not need words just then. They sold the Holloway ranch that summer, not because it needed to be sold, but because there was no one to work it and the land was good enough that it would find a family who would work it properly, which was more than letting it go to scrub. Kate went through the house before the sale, taking what mattered and leaving what didn't, and she found the tin box under her father's bed and opened it for the last time and took out the papers. The original loan document, the contract she had signed at the saloon, the fraudulent discrepancy written clear in the numbers. And she brought them home to Carson County and put them in the locked drawer of her office desk, because she had decided that she would keep them not as wounds but as evidence. Evidence that she had stood in an alley behind a saloon with $4.30 and a mockingbird overhead and refused to break, and that the refusal had been the start of everything. By 1880, the Barnett Ranch was one of the sound operations in Carson County. 600 head, the South Pasture expansion fully productive, the books in the kind of order that had attracted the attention of a land bank in Amarillo, whose representative had ridden out twice to discuss investment arrangements. Kate had declined both times on terms that were politely worded and absolutely final. She had no interest in bank investment. She had interest in the kind of slow, solid growth that was built from careful management and good grazing decisions, and knowing the difference between the deals worth taking and the ones worth walking away from. She was good at knowing that difference. She had learned it early and well. On a September evening in 1887 years, nearly to the month, from the afternoon she had stood at Crale's well with a tin cup of water and run the arithmetic on a stranger on a bay horse. Kate Holloway Barnett sat on the south porch of her own house and watched the evening come in across the Carson County grass. The creek caught the last of the light and held it. The cottonwoods moved in the easy evening wind. From inside the house came the sounds of William, now 6, arguing with Clara, now nearly 4, about some matter of supreme importance that would be completely forgotten by morning. Me's voice, authoritative and warm, cut through the argument and settled it, and there was a brief silence, and then the sounds of the ordinary business of the household resuming. Joel came out and sat in the chair beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and gave her one, and looked out at the evening the same way he always did, taking it in, reading it, finding in it what needed to be read. They sat together in the evening silence for a good while, the coffee warm in their hands, the wide West Texas sky going through its nightly performance of color: copper, rose, that deep arterial red that faded slowly into purple, and then the first deep blue of true dark, and the stars beginning, 1 and then 10, and then the whole enormous wash of them in that sky that had no limit and no end. "I was thinking," Joel said, "about expanding the north pasture." "The fence will need work first," Kate said. "Durham and Rodrigo can start next week if the weather holds." "The weather's going to turn by the 25th, she said. "We have a week and a half. It's manageable." He nodded. Sipped his coffee. "I was also thinking," he said, with that particular studied casual tone she had known for 7 years and loved for all of them, "that we have a very large house for 4 people and a cook." She looked at him sideways. The stars were coming in earnest now, filling the enormous dark sky from horizon to horizon. "Is that a general observation," she asked, "or a specific one?" "Specific," he said. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and in the starlight they were very clear and very warm. "I was thinking there might be room for another." Kate looked back at the stars. She thought about the tin box in the desk drawer and the mockingbird in the cottonwood and $4.30 sewn in a hem. And she thought about Joel riding east to Whitmore's ranch, and the kitchen at Crale's house and Edna's voice, saying, "Ask your young man to look at the original papers." And she thought about 7 years of cold mornings and long evenings and ledger pages and cattle counts, and 2 small people sleeping inside, who were the most real and remarkable things she had ever done. "There might be room," she said. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she threaded her fingers through his the way she had on the South Pasture walk in the summer of 1873. And the fit of it was the same as it had always been, right, certain, the shape of something that belongs. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, indifferent, magnificent patterns, and the creek ran silver below the cottonwoods, and the house behind them was warm with light and noise and life. And Kate Holloway Barnett held her husband's hand on the porch of her own home on land that was nobody's collateral, and felt, in the way that deep and lasting happiness is felt, quietly, completely, like a door that has been open for a long time finally, gently, closing shut.